All right, so one thing I've been talking about on my channel a lot, like these last couple of weeks, if you go look at my feed, one thing I talked about pretty consistently is how wide open the Western Conference is. Like there's the Oklahoma City Thunder, then you have to throw the Lakers back in that conversation, obviously, since you have a rejuvenated LeBron James and Anthony Davis after they won the gold medal in France. You'd have to also throw the Mavericks back in that conversation. They just won the West Finals, so they are the defending Western Conference champion. They also got Klay Thompson and some other really good role players on top of what they had last season. So a lot of teams in the mix in the West. The Sacramento Kings, who knows how good they're going to be next season after they went and got one of the best players in the Eastern Conference in DeMar DeRozan, and also the Memphis Grizzlies. They were already like on the brink of being a legitimate title contender out west before the situations that were going on with John Morant. Now they're back fully healthy, fully available. If you go look at that roster, it is one of the best rosters in the Western Conference. One team that I feel like is left out of a lot of conversations when we're talking about the Western Conference and how elite it is going to be this coming season are the Houston Rockets. And if you look at them, they were literally on the brink of being a play-in tournament squad. I thought they had a really, really good, no, not thought. I knew they had a really, really good first season under Ime Udoka. They made a lot of roster additions. Their biggest addition was bringing in and signing Fred VanVleet from the Raptors, who kind of gave them a little bit of maturity in the backcourt, a really smart playmaking championship level point guard to kind of pair alongside with a guy like Jalen Green, who I'm going to talk about in a second. But they kind of invested in that. And I thought they got a great return on their investment last season. For one, something I thought that was really interesting was that they were an elite level defensive team. I didn't think we were going to see an elite level defensive Rockets team in the early years of Jalen Green's career. I didn't think that was going to end up happening, right? With guys like Sengun on the roster. I didn't think that was going to be a reality, but I think that speaks to how great of a coach Ime Udoka was. Like there were so many situations that happened in Boston that made us forget what he did for that Celtics team and how he is one of the best defensive minds in all of basketball. Like remember that first round series, I think back in 22 against the Nets, the Celtics put on one of the best defensive performances in the playoffs, right? And one of the best I've seen. Like if I'm thinking about some of the best team defensive performances over the last couple of seasons, the Minnesota Timberwolves and what they did in certain games against the Denver Nuggets is up there. And also looking at what the Celtics did to the Nets back in 2022. And that was both Kyrie and Kevin Durant. And there were times where they just shut those guys down. And those are two players that I think a lot of us look at as unguardable, right? Those guys are like usually shoe-ins for 30 points per game every single night. We saw the Celtics pretty much render them ineffective. And that's a lot of what Ime Udoka brings to the table as a coach. So, like I said, I was a bit surprised that the Rockets were that good defensively last season. But another side of me can't because, again, it speaks to how great of a defensive mind that Ime Udoka is this season. And also talking about their players, you got to give a lot of credit to Jalen Green. So to be honest, I wasn't the highest on Jalen Green last season, or really when he kind of came out of the draft. I thought he was going to end up molding into like a volume scorer, and it could still end up happening. You never end up knowing. But guys like him and Anthony Edwards coming out of the draft, I thought their game was so focused on one thing. I didn't think they did other things very well to kind of make up for it. I thought they were going to kind of fall into that category of being volume scores. Yeah, they may get like 25 a game, but how many of those nights are they going to be efficient? But Jalen Green last season, especially like in the late second half of the season, was amazing. He had that streak where he was putting on these ridiculous scoring performances, really giving us a glimpse into this idea that he could still end up being a superstar level player. Like I remember there was so much hype for him coming out of the draft. Then he kind of had a little bit of a rocky start to his career. You'd expect something like that from a young scoring minded player. But last season, he showed us, hey, I can still end up being this superstar level player sometime down the road. Like he had some ridiculous performances. Then also talking about Alperen Sengun, another guy who I kind of felt like coming out of the draft, there was some hype, but not enough for enough people to kind of think he was going to end up molding into like this consistent starter, all-star level player. Like last year, there was a point where I definitely believe that Sengun had an argument to be an all-star, and he was right up in the most improved player conversation. He is one of the most entertaining big men in all of basketball, and it's not just like an entertaining thing. He's very effective, and they ran a lot of their offense through him, and it worked, right? That's why they was a good reason as to why they were a better team on the offensive end this particular season compared to the last couple of seasons, right? Like him showing that he's a guy you can really run the offense through, kind of get the ball to kind of like in the mid-range area and let things flow through him, kind of like Domantas Sabonis and the Kings. It really says a lot for his game. And those are two guys who I think we're going to see like in all NBA and all-star conversations sometime down the road. Like if I can think about two guys who are going to enter all-star conversations out in the West, two new guys, it'll really be those two, in my opinion. Then we also got to talk about like Jalen Williams and players like that. But Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green are clear within that conversation. Another guy you have to talk about that I was really intrigued by when he kind of came out of college is Cam Whitmore. So Cam Whitmore's draft year was a weird one. He kind of comes in, he's essentially a top 5 projected pick, right? One of the 5 best players in the class. And that still rings true, right? If we go back and look at that draft class, I still think he's one of the 5 best players in that class. But something happened, whether it was like pre-draft interviews, workouts, or whatever the case may be. He drops all the way from being top 5 projected, maybe top 6 projected at worst, all the way down to like the early 20s. But taking a step back and looking at things, the Rockets really made a steal with that draft by getting Thompson and by getting Cam Whitmore, 2 players who were essentially both top 5 level players in that draft. And so far throughout his career, he has been just amazing. He was great as a rotational piece last year for Houston. And we just saw what he did on the Summer League stage this past summer, playing alongside with Reed Shepherd, who I'm going to talk about in a second. He's ready to become one of those guys, right? And his role is going to be a little weird here in Houston. I don't think he's going to end up cracking the starting 5, but I think he's good enough for us to kind of see him coming off the bench for Houston if that remains his role over the next couple of seasons. He's good enough for us to kind of see his game and some point be like, this is a dude who I want to see kind of be the best player on his own team, right? Or like a high option on some team down the road, right? Kind of like a Tracy McGrady-esque thing when T-Mac was playing for the Raptors. He was kind of playing behind Vince Carter and things like that. And people kind of knew he had the ability to be like a franchise level guy or somewhat of a franchise level guy at some point in time. Then he finally broke through and got that opportunity. Or like Paul George, right? Paul George was a really good rotational piece in his first season for Indiana. Then he kind of gets thrust into this top option role and Danny Granger got hurt. I think Cam Whitmore can end up being kind of in that conversation at some point because he's just that good. A very wide skill set. He's extremely athletic. He is one of the best athletes right now in the league. A really almost complete offensive game. He has to sharpen some things up, but he is a really good player who I definitely think at some point in time could end up being a top option on a really, really good team. And again, we're going to kind of watch him here in Houston playing behind a Jalen Green and some of these other guys. And at some point, we're going to be like, I want to see him get his own squad, right? I want to see him be like a number 1 or number 2 option or just have a bigger role somewhere else. And I'm not trying to break him away here from Houston, but I think he's that good to be in that conversation. Another guy, I just mentioned him earlier, is Reed Shepherd. He's not going to start, but let's think about the upside here for Reed Shepherd. You're playing behind a championship-winning point guard, a very mature point guard, one of the best kind of true point guards in the NBA, in Fred VanVleet. You're going to be coming off the bench, and they're going to ask you to do a ton in year 1. For one, they have a strong defensive identity and culture, as I just talked about, Ime Udoka being here. He's going to be like the ultimate spark plug for them coming off the bench, kind of playing that TJ McConnell sort of role. He's going to be absolutely huge. He was great on the Summer League, as I just mentioned, as a playmaker, as a point of attack defender. What he showed at Kentucky was this ability to kind of play within a role. So he was coming off the bench. He was sharing backcourt duties with Rob Dillingham. So there were some nights where Rob was the guy and other nights where Reed was the guy. Those types of things, those intangibles, they definitely transfer over. So I think they have a really good set of guys who are all going to hold their own at some point with bigger roles on whatever team they are down the road in their careers. I don't want to break them away from Houston this early, but these guys they have, what I'm trying to say is have a ridiculous amount of upside. I think there are so many dudes here that have all-star, all-NBA level potential. I think they're just simply the best, the most talented young team in the NBA. And I know there are a lot of really good young teams right now, but if we're just talking about all-around talent and upside of their guys, Reed Shepherd, Jalen Green, Sengun, Cam Whitmore, They have some of the Thompson, right? They have some of the highest upside out of any younger team right now in the NBA. So I definitely think this season could be one where they enter that playoff conversation in the West. Again, the Western Conference is super wide open. There are going to be a lot of teams in the mix. Houston will definitely be in the mix for one. As I said, they have a strong culture and identity. That's what made the Orlando Magic work last season. Like, Orlando was able to be this good because of their defense. They have a culture and an identity. The Spurs won't be great until they establish that for themselves. And I think they can get there, probably that being their identity being on the defensive end, having guys like Victor Wembanyama and now Stephon Castle. But that's kind of what Houston's kind of working towards right now, is establishing a culture and an identity. And that's important for a young team that's trying to get from being on that rebuilding stage and trying to be a consistent playoff threat. And I think the Rockets are bridging that gap. As I said, last season, they were literally on the brink of being a play-in tournament team, which would have been a huge step. And I think this is the season where they end up finally taking off, no pun intended. Like, look at the Oklahoma City Thunder. They had their season back in 2023 where they were a play-in tournament team. And you look at them now, number one seed in the Western Conference just last season. I don't know if the Rockets are going to have that same fate, but it could be a similar thing. I think we're finally seeing Houston put it all together after having like a rough last couple of years, but they were kind of forced to rebuild. They were expecting to contend until James Harden kind of demanded his way out. And that kind of threw their plans in the trash a bit. But shout out to their front office for being able to recover. I thought it's been an amazing recovery job here for this Rockets team, but it's going to depend on how they do this season. Again, we've seen teams also have this success, this great success in 1 year and they're not being able to follow it up. Hopefully that's not the situation here for this Rocket squad. But as I said, they got the intangibles, they got the talent. This season is going to be about consistency, and that's going to be huge if they want to enter that conversation as far as playoff teams out in the stacked and talented Western Conference.